All right, in our last class, we talked about kind of the basics of Islam. I posted that link again in week 14 for y'all of the Empire of Faith. You can watch, I think there's 3 parts to it, but if you would watch the first part, because it's like the history of Islam, but if it piques your interest, I'm sure you can find the other 2 parts. I think altogether it's like a 5.5-hour documentary, but the first part's probably an hour and a half. But like I said, they do like a dramatization. They show Muhammad's early life. But it is curious in Islam, they do not, at least in Western Islam, like more the Middle Eastern versions, they do not portray images of things in heaven or things on earth. And that's based on the Old Testament injunctions against making graven images. And so they find it very disrespectful and idolatrous to try to make images of God, which they don't do. But even the prophet of Muhammad is usually represented with a veil, or he'll have like a halo or flames coming up behind him to show his enlightenment or his holiness. And as you move further east, though, when you get into like the Persian or the Shia type Islam, you see a lot of representational Islamic art. It's not just the abstract arabesque you'll see in Middle Eastern Islamic art, but you'll actually see representative art. You'll see fantastical creatures and beasts and angels and seraphims and jinn and all kinds of stuff. So I just think that's kind of interesting. But today we get to move to the smallest sect of Islam, but to me, they're the most fascinating. And these are the Sufis. And there's a lot of debate where the name Sufi came from. Some people believe it's a derivation of the Arabic word for wool, because the Sufis would wear these like wool garments around in the desert. Other people have maintained that Sufism, it's really a way of relating to God and the world. And it just so happens that it has coincided with Islam, so that we get Sufi Muslims. And most Sufi Muslims that I'm aware of, they still believe that there is no God but God, Muhammad is his prophet, and that the Quran is given by God and is instructive and authoritative. But as we get into the different Sufi schools of thought, you'll see there's a wide range of views even about the Quran or Sharia law. And so, let's see. I wanted to show you a quick video before I get going. For editing purposes, I think I'll show you the videos at the end, so I don't have to keep splicing these together, so I don't get flagged by YouTube. All right, so I'm just going to go through some of these different, because even within Sufism, it's not a unified whole. We have different flavors or sects within the Sufi system. So I'm just going to give you like a little sampler. Sufism is the underlying bond of Islam and has been there since the Prophet, even though it was not named so until much later in Islamic history. From the beginnings of Islam, there had existed group of ascetics. And remember, ascetics are people who renounce physical or temporal pleasure in the hopes of releasing or improving the spirit. These were called Zahad Korah Bakun, those who wept as they read the Quran and preached. How beautiful is that? I mean, when's the last time you read your Bible and you just started weeping? And so there's a profound sense of heart and passion here in this sect. So those who read the Quran and weep. These preachers held a powerful influence over the people as they gave embellished versions of Quranic stories and lessons. They would use material from a wide variety of sources, which included Christian, Jewish, Gnostic, and even Buddhist and Zoroastrian concepts. Indeed, anything that would make their sermons persuasive and effective was fair game. The Shia, who were influenced by the Christians, influenced the Sufis. And remember, the Shia we find predominantly in where the ancient Persian Empire was, or the Parthians in ancient Roman times. This influence was most noticeable in their views of a coming Messiah who would usher in an Islamic age. It is in all actuality, and if you're a Muslim watching this, I'm not trying to be respectful, but it really seems to me that the Shia branch of Islam adapted the Christian and Jewish messianic themes. And you could make the same critique about Christianity, right? You could say they totally stole the Messiah concept from the Jews and kind of repackaged it and made it their own. And we have a similar thing happening in Shia Islam with the coming of a unifying Messiah who will usher in the golden age. And we talked about that a little bit with the Gaddafis and Ayatollahs, not Gaddafi, sorry, the Ayatollahs in Iran. While the Sufis accepted the Quran and the Hadiths of the Prophet as their basis for spiritual authority, they were also aware that many different interpretations could be given to the sayings of the Prophet, as well as to the surahs of the Quran. The Sufis were masters of the allegorical interpretation. What a surprise, right? And they would look for the literal as well as the spiritual meanings, whether they were reading passages from the Quran or watching the sunset in the evening. For the Sufis, there was always something beyond the temporal, and spiritual lessons could be found everywhere, especially in nature. Maybe that's why I love them so much, where God manifested himself. As in the words of the Sufi Hazrat Inayat Khan, nature does not declare the glory of God. Nature is the glory of God. Okay. From the Quran, Surah 2, to God belong the east and the west. Whithersoever you turn, there is the face of God. God is all-embracing and all-knowing. Sariya al-Sakwati, in the 9th century, was one of the first systematizers of Islam, and he gave 3 guidelines for the Sufi way, so those who followed esoteric paths might avoid its accompanying pitfalls. All right. The Sufi is he whose light of divine knowledge does not extinguish the light of his piety. He does not utter esoteric doctrine, which is in contradiction to the exterior sense of the Quran and Surah, and the miracles vouchsafed to him do not cause him to violate the holy ordinances of God. All right, so I want to talk about the different degrees of Sufism. And so even in Sufism, we're going to have a spectrum. And so we're going to start with the more sober or orthodox versions. So the first is Al-Junayd, who was one of the earliest advocates of sober Sufism. But he desired more than anything to have union with God. This he knew could never happen in the present life since God is distant from creation. Al-Junayd, however, believed that if a person was able to die to self, all that would remain would be God. Are you hearing this? How incredible is this insight? He therefore developed the doctrine of annihilation or cessation of being, or just plain simple extinction. Once this state had been achieved, all that would be left would be continuance or abiding in God. This state of mystic union with God, however, was only temporary, and upon sobering, so they're imagining it almost like you're in an intoxicated state when you're in this union with God, just like you're drunk on wine. In this case, you're drunk in the spirit. You're just completely overwhelmed. But then, just like with alcohol, over time, you sober back up and you come back to this normal state of existence. And so in a sense, these Sufis are constantly looking for that next high, right? That next intoxication with God. This was not a pantheistic teaching of becoming God, but you see how subtle it is, though. The line is so fine here, because it sounds just like Buddhist annihilation of the self, right? When at least when I'm reading these concepts. Rather, it's having all base impurities removed so that nothing would stand between man and his God. For Al-Janud, separateness was also important, for it allowed man to revere and worship God, while at the same time desiring to be united with him. He even uses the analogy of man seeking God like a bride seeks her husband. And we see the same analogies in the New Testament. All right, so those are our first people out the chute. The next are called the Orthodox Sufis. And this was developed by Harith al-Mahasibi, once again in the 9th century. He had a moral conversion from rational theology to Sufism. He devoted himself to the propagating of orthodoxy, but with an emphasis on the inner life of the conscience. The essence of his teaching was not renunciation, but introspection to find the purity of motive. He warned that one had to be constantly on guard against self-deception, self-righteousness, and pride. Now let's get to the fun Sufis, the antinomian or anti-establishment Sufis. Antinomian is just a fancy Greek word that means against or outside the law. So this is like outlaw Islam, outlaw Sufism. The antinomian Sufis were extremely individualistic. They went so far as to reject the Sharia, that's like the community of Islamic law, and they believe that even religion separates one from God. Amen. Can I get a hallelujah? At times, their aversion to orthodoxy led them to extreme abuses of the law. But just as often, it left them admired by those who witnessed their pious or rather anti-pious acts. This led them into another trap, where they were viewed as ultra-religious while trying to avoid religion. I love it. Rather than making public spectacles of oneself, whether religiously or irreligiously, Al-Hajira recommended that one become non-existent. So we're back to that no self. All that people should be experiencing when they encounter you is Allah within. That is the goal. No more self, no more ego, just Allah. Some desire admiration, and others have what appears to be a masochistic craving for mortification. Both are attachments to this world, and thus impediments to the mystical life. Or you could put it another way, the obvious Sufi is not a real Sufi. You're not supposed to be making a spectacle or show of yourself. You're not supposed to be floating around town 6 feet, 6 inches off the ground. You should, by all intents and purposes, just seem like another person. It's simply, you are a Theotokos in the Islamic sense, that you are an Allah bearer. You are literally so connected to Allah that yourself is no longer part of the picture. This was the most extreme form of Sufism, for they considered Islamic law little more than human opinion. Can you imagine? Just saying like, that's your opinion, man, in an Islamic Sharia country. Their main goal was to remain in an ecstatic, intoxicated state of union with God as much as possible. Often while in these ecstatic states, they would have utterances which were scandalous, if not outright heretical, within the Orthodox Islamic community. Abu Yazid Bastami, when he realized God dwelt within his own soul, saw him and exclaimed, "Glory be to me, how great is my majesty." Now, he wasn't saying he was all that, but he was gone. And so when he looked inside of himself, he was just like, holy God. Okay. Or Al-Hallaj's famous utterance that later cost him his life. Ana al-Haq, I am God. While neither al-Bastami nor al-Hallaj were pantheists, their views and identification with God were too much for the general Islamic community. Usually such ecstatic utterances were written off as just that, or were reinterpreted in more orthodox language. One of al-Hallaj's favorite analogies was to compare himself being drawn to his beloved like a moth to the flame. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but I was camping once in Northern California in the meadow by the edge of this great forest. And I had my little fire ring there and my fire going. And out of the forest came thousands of moths that were attracted to my flame. And it was so horrifying in that there was such a lust for light that they would literally fly into my fire and be consumed by the flames. And this is what Al-Hallaj is describing our relationship to God. We should be like a moth drawn to the flame of God's light and love and want to be consumed in the very fire of God. Good stuff. I eventually had to put my fire out because I couldn't take it. When this one moth was coming so fast, he went through the fire. It had burned off his wings. He hit the ground and he crawled back into it. And I was just like, nope, no more fire tonight. I can't handle. Although it made such a great illustration when I finally came across this passage years later. I was like, yeah, I get it, man. You're so drawn to the beloved that you have no regard for yourself anymore. It's all just wanting to be consumed in the love of the other. Finally, in 922, it's funny because Al-Hallaj, he would go from one Sufi master to the other, but they were all just too conformist for him. He was like too nonconformist, even for the nonconformist Sufis. And in 922, he was crucified in Baghdad for blasphemy. This was because he refused to renounce his complete identification with God. It is said that he went to the cross laughing. He thanked God that he had revealed to him the fire of his face. Apparently, during his long and painful death, he prayed this prayer. And these thy servants who are gathered to slay me, in zeal for thy religion, long to win thy favor. Forgive them, Lord. Have mercy on them. Surely, if thou had shown them what you showed me, they would never have done what they have done. And if you had kept from me what you have kept from them, I would never have suffered this tribulation. Whatsoever thou wilt do, I praise thee. Whatsoever thou wilt do, I praise thee. And it's just stunning to think about. No surprise, as you can imagine, the Sufis absolutely love Jesus because Jesus talks like this all the time, right? I and the Father are one. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. And so they're just thinking, and Jesus gets it. Jesus is doing this total identification with the Godhead. And so big fan of Jesus among the Sufis. The doctrine of sainthood. I'm going to skip that part. All right. I want to, how much time? I got time. I want to highlight one Sufi in particular for you. And he goes by Al-Ghazali. His full name is Abu Hamid Ibn Muhammad Al-Ghazali. What a great name. Ibn means like son of. So if you hear that in like an Arabic name, that's what the Ibn is. Abu Hamid Ibn Muhammad Al-Ghazali. And he's given the grand title of the reviver of Islam. And he lived from 1058 to 1111. So this is almost the same time as like Saint Francis of Assisi, which is so interesting because Saint Francis had a very similar role in Christianity that Al-Ghazali had in Islam. And even by the 9th century or the 11th century here in Islam, it had gone, it had become legalistic and dead and structured. And Al-Ghazali, he was, I'm just going to tell you this instead of reading it. So Al-Ghazali was a professor in Baghdad. The Arabic world already had universities and studies long before Europe had thought of it. And if you watch that Empire of Faith documentary, I believe it's the second episode that talks about the art, the science, the exploration, the medicine, the mathematics, the astronomy of the Arabic people and what they contributed to the world. And to be fair, a lot of those things they did not invent or create, but because of their geographic location in between Asia and Europe, they were like the crossroads, right? The trade routes ran through them. And so they became the disseminators of not just goods, but also ideas, concept, technologies, techniques, information passing through the Islamic world. And it had a huge influence upon them. And so they were excellent at collecting information or knowledge from different cultures and then making it their own and redisseminating it. All right. So anyways, Al-Ghazali, he's a professor of religious studies in Baghdad, and he has kind of like this crisis of faith moment. And he claims that Allah actually took his voice from him and he could no longer teach. And he had been putting off the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And when he had no voice, he realized this is probably the time to do it since I can't be teaching. So he took care of his will, took care of his wife and his family, made sure that they were provided for, and then he went off on pilgrimage to Mecca. And I believe this was like a 3-year journey. Once again, echoes back to like the Apostle Paul in the wilderness for 3 years after his conversion experience. So he goes to Mecca and has this profound experience. And what happens is he was basically like an intellectual Muslim. He knew all the doctrines, he knew the Quran, he knew all the creeds, he was an apologist, a teacher, but it wasn't in here. It was all up here. And what happened to him at Mecca was he describes it, he was like, my life was this very intricate and elaborate vase that had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces, and I couldn't put it back together again. And then after this Mecca experience, God began to reshape his life anew. But now it was through this existential personal encounter with Allah, not just what he read in the Quran, not just what he heard from other people, but he had encountered God personally. And when he came back to Baghdad and his voice had been returned, his teaching, as you can imagine, was quite different. He still had the intellectual stuff, but now he had the passion and the spirit and the soul to go with it. And so he really helped reinvigorate or reinvitalize Islam from just a legalistic standards of do's and don'ts to this vibrant relationship with God himself. Al-Ghazali. All right. Gee, I hope I brought my some of my Islamic poetry home. I'll go check, but I'm going to show you a couple samples now of Sufis in action. And part of what I love about them, like I mentioned, the closest I could relate them to a Christian sect, it would be like charismatic Islam. And so they're really going to be into like song and dance and a lot of the visuals, a lot of the emotional aspects. And I just want to give you a little sampler of some Sufis, and they too have a spectrum. Just like in our own Pentecostal, charismatic, and Christianity, right? We have everything from people who may privately speak in tongues during their prayer time with God to people who are pass me another rattlesnake, right? And don't hold back on the strychnine. So we have the same huge spectrum in Christianity, but the same thing exists in Sufism. And so I want to show you a little sampler. All right, I'm going to stop recording this.